much physiology as we're going to get into for anatomy class. There's a succinct number of those groups of cells, and I'm going to diagram them on the board. We have a small clear marking lab, and those structures are painted on it in yellow, but some of them are a little hard to get to, so I may mark the region on a heart model and put up one of my little notes that says identify the component of the conduction system located here. So it's one of these structures I'm looking for. All right, so a group of these specialized cells are located at the base of the right atrium. Sorry, the base of the superior vena cava in the right atrium. And that structure is known as the sino-atrial node, abbreviated SA node. But as you probably know by now, the quizzes and exams get to write out. Thank you so much. Okay. This is also known as the pacemaker of the heart because its cells depolarize at a faster rate than any other component. Without modification by the vagus nerve, this will cause, this depolarizes at a rate of 100 times a minute. Obviously, most of us don't have a resting heart rate of 100 beats a minute. And so it is the vagus nerve, remember that's the homeostatic one, rest and digest. So the vagus nerve is going to affect this and slow the heart rate down and decrease the heart rate to approximately 72. Now, exercise and stress and other things can modify that. Okay. But average heart rate is around 70 to 72. Mine's about 78. My husband's is about 48. But he does more activity than I do. So this is called a pacemaker because it sets the pace. The other locations will depolarize, but not as rapidly. So they will not have reached the point of the minimum threshold current before the current coming from the SA node overpowers them and causes them to depolarize. So an electrical current, in other words, a flow of charged particles, is formed by these cells, and it passes through the cardiac muscle cell via gap junctions from cell to cell. And that triggers the muscle cells to depolarize, and they then contract. So passing through the cardiac muscle cell, from right atrium through the left atrium as well, these blue dotted lines represent that electrical current. And in response to that current, the cells contract. So the cells, the two atria are going to contract in this direction. They're going to start at the top and squeeze down. Most of the blood flow from atria to ventricle occurs while the heart is at rest, meaning the atria are not contracting. And then at the last moment, when the SA node fires, the atria will contract and squeeze a little bit more into the ventricle. But you can live without the atria contracting. The atria can actually fibrillate and sit there and quiver. All right? And you can still live. You wouldn't even know that that's occurring. Because the force of contraction to move heart through the blood through the body is required from the ventricles. Now, if we're squeezing blood into the ventricles and we keep moving in this direction, we've got a problem because there's no outflow at the apex of the heart. Okay? So we have to block the flow of electrical charges and restart it from the apex and now allow the heart to contract in this direction. So because of the connective tissue that is present in the valves and throughout the heart at this level, that collagen and dense irregular connective tissue is non-conductive, is known as the cardiac skeleton. It's not really bone, but it's a support for the valves to attach to, and it blocks conduction. we have to make our way through that blockage if we're going to get that electrical current going again in the ventricles. And so there is another point of autorhythmic cells, meaning they depolarize on their own, located just in the interatrial septum, down near the atrioventricular valve on the right side. And this particular component of the conduction system is identified as the atrioventricular node, or AV node. It will depolarize on its own, but not as rapidly. So if the SA node isn't working, the atrioventricular node will fire, and it only fires at the pace of about 60 times a minute. We still have to get through the cardiac skeleton. So when the SA node fires 100 times a minute, or slowed down to 70, it's going to get to the AV node before it reaches its depolarization, and it will cause it to fire as well. And now that electrical current is carried through the base of the interatrial septum, and to the top of the interventricular septum. And this is known as the atrioventricular bundle. The older name, which you are welcome to use if it's easier to remember, is the bundle of His, named after a person with the last name of His. So don't confuse atrioventricular node with atrioventricular bundle. Okay? That bundle now is the component that transfers the electrical current from the atria to the ventricles. But remember, we don't want to start that current at this area, but we want to carry it down and allow it to start from the apex. So the atrioventricular bundle has two branches, right and left bundle branches. The atrioventricular bundle itself will fire about 40 times a minute, okay? As does the bundle branches. Let's do the bundle branches. So these are found, bundle branches are found in the interventricular septum. They are seen on our regular models of the heart. They're painted as two white lines with little branches coming off, going down the side of the interventricular septum. Now remember, in the sheep heart, we saw a band that looked a little bit like chordae tendineae, but most of the hearts were bigger, that crossed through the right ventricle. That's known as the moderator band. It's not chordae tendineae, but it carries electrical current over to one of the papillary muscles on the right side. This is where your lab manual starts, but we continue to carry that current up the outside wall of each ventricle. And these structures are identified as conduction myofibers, and the older name are the Purkinje fibers. Even the ventricular muscle cells will depolarize on their own, about 15 times a minute, but that's not compatible with life. Because if we just have a quivering of the ventricles, there is no concerted effort to create a force, and the blood does not move out of the heart. Therefore, you have no blood pressure, you have no transport of blood carrying the oxygen to the rest of the body. while I have the heart here, I want to go back and review blood flow through the heart. There's two ways of doing this. Right? So as a physiology, as a function of the heart, blood is flowing into the right atrium from the three structures, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus. That's deoxygenated blood. At the same time that oxygenated blood is flowing into the left atrium. So blood flows into both atria, through both atrioventricular valves, which are open, into both ventricles at the same time. That occurs during rest. Then the atria give a squeeze, and as they're relaxing, the ventricles now give a squeeze because that current has passed through the interventricular septum and is now restarting at the apex. So now the ventricles give a squeeze, and blood moves out the pulmonary trunk and the aorta at the same time. So we don't have each chamber contracting in sequence. The heart is at rest. Two atria contract, two ventricles contract, the heart is at rest. Two atria contract, two ventricles contract, heart is at rest. Okay? So if you were to hear heart sounds, you would hear lub-dup, lub-dup, lub-dup. And that's the turbulence created as the valves close. So remember, the valves close not because muscles pull them close, but by what force? Pressure. So I just want to put a summary up here. When the heart is at rest, and our term for rest is diastole. So you may have heard of diastolic pressure. When the heart is at rest, pressure is greater in the atria. Well, let me rephrase this here. Pressure is greater in the aorta, and we're going to assume the pulmonary trunk goes along. So aortic pressure is greater than atrial pressure, and that is greater than ventricular pressure. If aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, that means that blood is flowing back down the pulmonary trunk, back down the aorta, and our semilunar valves are closed. Okay, so this isn't something that you need to memorize. You just visualize the blood flowing from a high pressure in the blood vessels to a lower pressure in the ventricles, and that fills those cups up that we saw on the sheep heart and closes the valves. All right? So when this situation occurs, our semilunar valves are closed. If atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, we're talking about the force here. If atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, the atrioventricular valves are going to be open. And you can visualize that because blood is flowing from atria to ventricles. Then the SA node fires, the atria contract, current passes through the interventricular septum to the apex of the ventricles, and now the ventricles contract. And as pressure rises in the ventricles, that pushes the atrioventricular valves closed. So at that time now, the semilunar valves are still closed, so aortic pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, and that is greater than atrial pressure. So because aortic pressure is still greater than ventricular pressure, our semilunar valves are still closed. Ventricular pressure, when it becomes greater than atrial pressure, causes the AV valves to close. Blood isn't going anywhere yet right now because both sets of valves are closed. Pressure rises very rapidly in the ventricles because the space is still getting smaller and blood's not going anywhere. All right? So the next thing that happens is ventricular pressure becomes greater than aortic pressure. which is greater than atrial pressure. So ventricular pressure is still greater than atrial pressure. Our AV valves are still closed. But now ventricular pressure is greater than aortic pressure, and what's that going to do to the semilunar valves? It's going to push them open. Okay? So now the semilunar valves open. So I'm just showing you the sequence of pressure gradient changes, relationship between each set on either side. So don't memorize this list, but if I tell you that ventricular pressure is greater than aortic pressure, you should be able to recognize that that means that it's going to push the semilunar valves open. Does that make sense? Now what happens when aortic pressure, the ventricles relax, and aortic pressure becomes greater than ventricular pressure? Blood flows back towards the left ventricle, fills up the semilunar valves, and they snap shut. All right? So that's the last thing I'm going to write up there now. We're going to go back to this situation. As the heart relaxes, aortic pressure now becomes greater than ventricular pressure, which is still greater than atrial pressure. And our semilunar valves close. And the AV valves are still closed. And then finally we come back up, the heart rests, and we're back up to this point right here. Okay? So that just illustrates how it's a pressure change on either side of the valve. So the first thing that happens then in our cardiac cycle, the heart's at rest, the AV valves are open, ventricles contract, you hear the lub sound. Okay? Pressure then is greater in the ventricles than the aorta. The semilunar valves open, and then the heart relaxes, and you hear the dup sound. So that lub dup that you hear with the stethoscope is those changing valves in the heart pressure relationship. All right, before we leave this then, that's how the heart actually works. But if we were to follow one red blood cell through the heart, it obviously can't be in both right and left chambers at the same time. So if we were to follow one red blood cell, let's say it's coming from the brain, then, and you have this sequencing from your online notes, it would come in from the superior vena cava, the right atrium, through the right atrioventricular valve, into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary trunk, to the lungs. Remember, one blood cell. Pick up oxygen, back from the lungs, through the pulmonary veins, into the left atrium, through the left atrioventricular valve, into the left ventricle, out the aortic valve, into the aorta. Okay, that's following one drop of blood or one red blood cell through the different chambers. Okay, any questions on that before we talk really briefly about the structure of a blood vessel and then start looking at the pattern of blood flow through the vessels? Structure of blood vessels. I'm not going to go through the structure of every single component, but I'm going to highlight some of the key features. And let me describe for you first the three layers of a blood vessel wall. So, anybody remember what the lining of blood vessel walls are formed of? Identical to the lining of the heart. What type of connective tissue would this be? Simple squamous epithelium. So whether we're talking about a vein or an artery, it would be lined with simple squamous epithelium. What type of tissue do we have with every epithelium? Loose irregular connective tissue. And these two tissues together form the innermost layer of our blood vessels, known as a tunica intima. That would be the homologous or equivalent structure of the endocardium of the heart, right? The lining of the heart. The muscle of the heart is cardiac muscle. In our blood vessels, it is smooth muscle. It is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system only. So an increase in sympathetic neurotransmitters would cause blood vessels to constrict, and a decrease would cause them to dilate, okay, rather than using the balance of parasympathetic and sympathetic like we do in the heart. This layer of smooth muscle is known as the tunica media. And remember, with our nerves, we talk about a covering of connective tissue, the perineurium or epineurium, depending on what layer we were talking about. So we also have a dense, irregular outer layer of connective tissue that helps to support these vessels. And so this outermost layer is known as the tunica externa or adventitia. Blood vessels will have varying degrees. All of our blood vessels will have varying degrees of these layers. If we look at the sequence of blood flow, remember the highest pressure is closest to the heart. And so we start out with arteries. The ones closest to the heart, have addition to the smooth muscle, have elastic sheets that help them recoil back to their original diameter. And then we go to smaller and smaller arteries. And then we get to an arteriole. An arteriole has all these three layers. However, the tunica media is limited to only 2 layers of smooth muscle. Because there are so many arterioles, this is the key vessel in regulating blood pressure, because it can contract and quickly affect the diameter will affect the peripheral resistance. And just like putting your finger over the end of a garden hose and water starts to back up behind that, it causes pressure to increase more dramatically than any of our other sets of blood vessels do. The arteriole loses its smooth muscle, loses its dense irregular outer layer, and we get to a capillary. So capillaries have only a simple squamous epithelium and the accompanying loose irregular connective tissue. That means they have a very thin wall component, and so this is our site for gas and nutrient exchange. So this is where the oxygen leaves the blood and the carbon dioxide comes back in. Now the capillaries, they're the most numerous of all of our components. The capillaries come back and reform larger vessels, and those are identified as venules. And it's in the venules closest to the capillaries that our white blood cells actually escape to leave the blood and get out into the connective tissue. So white blood cells for the connective tissue from the venules. You have an infection or just an ordinary, that's where they exit the blood. Then these form larger and larger veins. So the veins have less smooth muscle in the tunica media than the arteries do. Why? Low pressure. All right. Veins also will demonstrate valves, similar to your semilunar valves. So as blood is pushed towards the heart in the deep veins when you walk, and gravity pulls it back, it's not going to go back as far. Another key difference, not just the amount of smooth muscle, but the orientation. Smooth muscle in the arteries and the arterioles is the cells are wrapped in a cross-section and wrapping circularly around the muscle. And so this is a tight wrapping. We look at the arrangement of that smooth muscle to resist the pressure, whereas in the veins, it's a very loose spiral. That's about it for vessels. Yes?
Do the venules have valves?
No. All right, unless there's any questions, so what I want to do now for the rest of our time is to diagram, kind of like I was drawing a road map, the vessels leaving the heart and their branches. And remember how I encouraged you to draw on your bodies the muscles that we were covering? It really helps if you do this with blood vessels as well. You just need to make sure that you use water-soluble ink. So let me illustrate what I'm talking about. I made the mistake of doing this for a class of AR once with dry erase pens, and it doesn't come off very well without alcohol. Fortunately, my son had a basketball game that night, and his school colors are red and white, so I just filled in the rest of my face. And then I had to scrub really hard when I got home. But the water-soluble ones come off easily. So this was actually a cousin of one of my students here a few years ago, and I get permission before I put these pictures up. And I'm sure he's doing the walk like a magician or showing off his guns or whatever. You can see there's a variation in the amount of effort that went into these. So not only does it help you, you could practice on just a piece of paper, but actually feeling this on your skin and the process of drawing it helps you remember it, just like using the muscles when you were learning them helps you remember where they are and what they're doing. Like I said, all sorts of variations on. So it's not really warm enough to go lay out on the beach and draw on yourself. I've had students go to the adult bookstores and find those blow-up dolls and draw them. They brought them to me, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I stuffed it in a paper sack, and then eventually I just threw it away. But it's fun to do, and again, it really helps you. It's like drawing a map for somebody and showing them how to get to your house. You see that in your mind's eye. You see the gas station on the corner, and you know where the different landmarks that you give to them. And so doing it helps in preparing as you visualize these components. Your questions on the lab exam obviously are going to be to identify the vessels. Lecture exams would be questions, which of the following arteries is a branch of the celiac trunk? Or which of these two vessels join together to form what vein? And if you can do a really quick line drawing. You don't have to do the double lines that I'm going to do now, but you can do a really quick line drawing and cover all the vessels in about 3 minutes. Okay? If you practice, and then I'll give you a blank piece of paper as part of the lecture exam, and you can just put that down and then refer to it as you answer questions instead of having to pull that image up in your mind's eye each time. So we're going to start with the heart. And I'm going to draw that part down low here. Move all the blood vessels up the head, up the neck to the head, and then I'll move it up to do the vessels of the upper extremity. So basic heart here. And the aorta is divided into 4 components. You may have just heard of 3, ascending, arch, and descending, but I divide the descending into the thoracic and abdominal components. So the first thing we see here is the aorta arising out of the center of the heart. And the very first branches to come off of the aorta, coronary arteries. And rather than clutter this up with all the words, I'll just kind of keep a legend over here. So we have right and left coronary arteries. On the lab exam, those structures related to the heart and a couple others that we will designate as left or right. The lab exam, you don't have to identify left or right. Okay? Where the heart, yes, the right and left coronary arteries, right and left atrium, the right and left valve. But if it's the right radial artery, just radial artery is fine. This region of the aorta is known as the ascending aorta. And then it forms an arch that arches over to the left but also posterior. Now I can't draw behind my board, so the movement to the left is exaggerated. But we would have this portion here would be the arch, either aortic arch or arch of the aorta, either one is fine. And then we would have the thoracic aorta. Now in our models in the lab, we have the arch of the aorta on the hearts, and then they kind of stop there. But now you can reference their structures. So the very first branch off the arch of the aorta is going to the right side of the body and is identified as brachiocephalic trunk. Brachio refers to what component of the body? Heart. And cephalic, head. So this has 2 branches, one going to the right arm and one going to the right side of the head and the neck. We do not have a brachiocephalic trunk on the left side. In the fetus, you used to, but as the arch grew, it gradually resorbed that left brachiocephalic trunk, and so it's absent by the time the infant is born. Branching off of the brachiocephalic trunk, so this would be like a lecture type question. Which of the following are the branches of the brachiocephalic trunk? Or the subclavian artery is a branch, the right subclavian artery is a branch of which of the following? So this first branch here, as well as the second branch off of the arch of the aorta, are identified as the common carotid arteries. And that's what you're feeling when you take your pulse after you've been exercising on the side of your neck. A single A is artery and a double A are arteries, okay, for my abbreviation. The common carotid arteries, and I'm just going to draw it on one side here, then divide into an internal and an external. Anytime we see the term common, which is one other time, we have that component. So about the angle of the neck, the angle of the jaw, right about here, under the sternocleidomastoid muscle, we have that division occurring. I'm going to make mine short because I have the rest of this board up here. We have the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. External carotid artery is going to go to the face and the back of the head inside the behind the jaw. And internal carotid artery goes to the brain. There are quite a few branches off the external carotid artery. It gives branches to your thyroid and larynx. It gives branches to the back of your head, as I indicated. The couple that we're going to look at go to the face itself and to the side of the scalp. All right. So we're going to focus on those two branches. The one that goes to your face is highly tortuous. You can actually feel right here along the edge of your jaw, there's a gap in the masseter. And if you just lay a couple of fingers there, kind of slide your hand along the edge of your jaw, and you'll feel a little indentation. Lay a couple of fingers there lightly, and you should be able to pick up a pulse, an expansion and collapse of the arterial wall as the heart beats. All right, on our models in lab, look on our head models, and you'll see this artery make this tortuous twisting turn from both sides up the side of the nose. And then, of course, other branches are given off of that. So that is known as the facial artery. There's a lot of blood vessels, but they don't have other processes that you have to know like we did for bones. And they're often named for the location. So facial artery is on the face. Okay. The external carotid artery ends by going up on the side of your head. And if you've had a headache, you put your hands there, you can feel this pulsing. That vessel is the superficial temporal artery. And it has several branches that we just call all of them the superficial temporal artery on the lateral aspect of the head over the temporal bone. So if I were to say, which of the following blood vessels supplies oxygenated blood to the zygomaticus? Facial artery. Okay, just like it was facial nerve that innervated those muscles. Which of the following blood vessels supplies oxygenated blood to the temporalis muscle? Superficial temporal artery. Okay. Now, as I said, there are a lot of other branches that we're not going to deal with. Let's take a look now at the internal carotid artery. Well, let me do one more branch on here, and then we'll look at the blood supply to the brain. Anybody remember what the opening in the skull is that the internal carotid artery passes through? Carotid foramen or carotid canal. Okay. So the two internal carotid arteries carry most of the blood to the brain. But we do have another vessel that comes off of this other branch. You're familiar with this one. You've seen it multiple times. It passes through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra and then through the foramen magnum. And this vessel is on both sides, vertebral artery. Okay, so they're very small. They pass through the cervical transverse foramina. At the top of the first cervical vertebra, they come together and enter the skull via the jugular foramen. So the internal carotid artery enters the skull via the carotid canal. Vertebral arteries enters the skull through the foramen magnum. This branch right here is in fact, I'm just going to write the number inside the vessel. Give myself some room. Subclavian artery. So the vertebral arteries are branches off of the subclavian. Yes?
Is the subclavian artery a part of the trunk?
It's the second branch. So the brachiocephalic trunk divides to form the common carotid and the subclavian. Okay. On the other two branches, this would be the left common carotid, and the left subclavian comes off of the arch. So our three branches of the aortic arch are brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, and left subclavian. So they come off separately. They used to have this common trunk, but that got reabsorbed. Now I'm going to leave this here for a moment and diagram the blood supply to the brain. So we have 4 vessels that carry blood to the brain. 2 internal carotids and 2 vertebral arteries. Okay. I'm going to draw the vertebral arteries first. They're traveling up the ventral surface of the brainstem. And so over the medulla, we have these 2 vertebral arteries. And this opening right here would be the foramen magnum. They then travel on the surface of the medulla oblongata, on the ventral surface. So any blockage of vessels branching off, and there are vessels that branch off of here, I just haven't drawn them on there. Any blockage of vessels branching off of there, or the vertebral arteries themselves, can result in instantaneous death, because remember what's 2 specific life you require these structures to live? Controlling the heartbeat is cardiovascular center, and breathing, the respiratory centers. All right, so if we block blood supply to the medulla, you can't live. Again, these are the vertebral arteries. And they come together and form a single vessel as it travels over the pregnant or pure belly of the pons. Remember what I called that swollen basal pons. And so this vessel now is called the basilar artery, which is the whole reason why I had to learn basal pons. It then ends by forming a T. And these 2 vessels wrap around the midbrain and supply the cerebellum and the occipital lobe of the brain. Those are our most posterior structures. And so these 2 vessels are identified as the posterior cerebral arteries. All right? So to the cerebellum and occipital lobe. And that's the blood supply derived from the vertebral arteries. The The other pair of vessels coming in through the carotid canal are the internal carotid arteries. This is kind of hard to visualize sometimes because this is tilted this direction. Our brainstem is kind of tilted like this, and the internal carotid arteries are coming up through the carotid canal like this. And so when we see them in this view, they are actually kind of cut. So those are the cut surfaces of the internal carotid arteries. And the most largest branch extends out through the lateral sulcus. And then a very small branch from each one passes up through the longitudinal fissure and arches over the corpus callosum on the medial surface of the brain. So IC stands for internal carotid artery, okay? Passing through the lateral sulcus, we have the middle cerebral arteries, and they're going to supply most of the brain. So frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, all of the lateral surfaces of the brain. This is the most common cause of blood clot. And this one, or branches of this one, are the most common locations when you have someone having a stroke and they're paralyzed on one side or they can't talk. It's because of blockage in this vessel or one of its vessels. So the lateral lobes of the brain, lateral surfaces. These two vessels are the anterior cerebral arteries. And they supply the medial surface of the brain. So inside the longitudinal fissure. Now the way I've drawn it, we don't have a closed anastomotic circulation. Some people have atherosclerotic blocks, and they can have 90 to 95% of their internal carotid arteries blocked and not show any signs of hypoxia to the brain. And that's because blood is now getting to the brain primarily through the vertebral arteries. So we have to connect these two systems. Connecting this system to here, we have a pair of slender vessels known as the posterior communicating arteries. And that connects the internal carotid set of vessels with the basilar artery set of vessels. Two of those, and then connecting right to left, we have a single slender anterior communicating artery. Bless you. And that's known as the cerebral circuit. The older name used to be circuit of Willis. So if I say, which of the following blood vessels supplies blood to the temporal lobe? Middle cerebral artery. Which of the following blood vessels supplies blood to the medial surface of the brain? Anterior communicating. Okay? And you can see these vessels on some of our models of the brain in lab. So, yes?
Sorry, what does anterior communicating arteries supply?
It just connects left and right.
So it supplies to the...
It doesn't supply anything. It just connects the left and right sides of the blood supply to the brain. So if we had a blockage on this side, or say here, blood could flow up here and back around and then, or flow through here and then over to that side. It just connects, so we have a complete circuit. Now let's continue to follow the blood through the subclavian artery. And this is not in your lab manual, but I'm going to add it here. There is a vessel that descends down the front of your chest, just a couple of inches on the deep side of your chest wall, a couple of inches lateral to the sternum. It's going to do so on both sides. And it's going to give branches that kind of separate a little bit because our sternum is really here. But it's going to give arteries that run between the ribs from front to back. It's going to meet up with vessels that come from the back and come back around. So, where are we here? This vessel right here, number 13, and these vessels, number 14. Location is what we derive its name from, internal. Thoracic artery. Those are the ones running straight down. And the ones running between the ribs, no big surprise. Intercostal, they're anterior intercostal arteries. Now let's take the subclavian down into the upper extremity. So as its name indicates, it travels inferior to the clavicle and into the axilla. As soon as it passes deep to the clavicle, we change its name. And it now is known as the axillary artery. Travels in the axillary area. It has a ton of branches, all right, that wrap around the shoulder area and supply shoulder muscles and the bones of your shoulder joint. Then it's going to pass by the teres major, and as soon as it passes along the inferior border of the teres major, it's now considered to be in the upper extremity. And what's our term for the arm again? Brachial, brachii, brachiocephalic trunk, biceps brachii muscle. So it now becomes the brachial artery. The brachial artery, if you've ever taken someone's blood pressure or had your blood pressure taken, the brachial artery is the one that's compressed by the blood pressure cuff. And then as you listen with the stethoscope, you start to hear as you decrease the pressure and the pressure from the heart overcomes the collapsed vessel, you start to hear that sound. That's the blood flowing through the brachial artery that you're hearing. Just above the elbow, it divides into two major arteries. There's a lot of branches around the elbow that we're not dealing with. And you know, what is the lateral bone of the arm? Radius. And so we have 17, which will be the radial artery, and 18, which is the ulnar artery. In the hand, a major portion of the ulnar artery branches over and joins with the radial artery, and a major portion of the radial artery branches over and joins with the ulnar. In the lab manual, in the hands and models that we have in the lab, all right, you can see their relative relationship. And so we have 19 and 20. Superficial palmar arch, and 20, the deep palmar arch. Major blood supply to the superficial palmar arch comes from the ulnar artery, The radial artery wraps around, and its thickest portion passes between the thumb and second finger. And the radial artery is a major supplier of blood to the deep palmar arch. Now in lab, you also have the terms common and proper digital arteries, and those are what are going up the fingers. Okay, I'm not going to diagram them on the board. Vessels and nerves to your fingers are not running down the middle of your finger, but there are a pair, and they travel on each side, so the medial and lateral aspects of each finger, which I found out when I slammed my finger in the suburban door, and the door actually closed all the way shut. It finished it sideways this way and not that way, and so my tip of my finger was numb until that nerve could grow back. So that's where it's supposed to be protected to have it on the side there, unless you turn your hand. All right, so that's blood supply to the head and neck and upper extremity. I erased the material on this board. You guys okay with that? All right, so now I'll leave that up there. And let's follow. I'm going to move the heart up so I can diagram. Oh, let me come back and do branches of the thoracic aorta first. And then we'll follow the blood down into the abdominal cavity. Coming off the back of the thoracic aorta, so I'm going to draw dotted lines. We have our posterior intercostals. And the anterior and the post intercostals meet and join along the lateral aspect of the rib. So 19 and 20 are over there. Posterior intercostal. Now the next vessel that I'm going to draw, don't have on any of our models. It actually comes off of the aorta directly behind the heart, and these vessels follow the pulmonary arteries and veins to the hilus of the lungs. And these are, so I'm going to actually draw them off a little bit here, but these go to the right and the left lungs. And they are bronchial arteries. This question will be on the exam, so listen up. What vessel transports oxygenated blood to the lungs? Oxygenated blood to the lungs. I just drew it on the board. Bronchial arteries. Pulmonary arteries are transporting to the lung, but it's not oxygenated. Remember, those are branches off of the pulmonary trunk, which comes out of the right ventricle, which is deoxygenated blood. But the lung tissue, that's going to the lungs for a purpose to pick up oxygen. But the lung tissue still has muscle and fibroblasts and nerves and epithelial tissue that need their own oxygenated supply. And that's how they get it. It's from the bronchial arteries. So along with the bronchial arteries and, pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins, we're going to have bronchial arteries and veins passing through the medial surface of the lung tissue. All right, so I'm going to draw the heart up here a little bit higher, a lot higher. And the muscle that the heart is resting on is the diaphragm. And so coming down behind the heart here, we're going to have the, actually, I'm going to make that much shorter. We'll just draw the diaphragm. More room. So slightly to the left, not right in the middle, because the aorta descends down the left side of the bodies of the vertebrae. We have the aorta. I'm going to draw two parallel lines all the way down so that I get to erase with my finger. All right, so you might want to wait a little bit till I go back up and add the branches off of the abdominal aorta. So, 23, abdominal aorta. And those are the four parts of the aorta. Ascending aorta, arch of the aorta, thoracic aorta, and then abdominal aorta. Okay? You might see the term descending, but that's combining thoracic and abdominal. And the first branch off of the aorta comes up quite high. And these vessels go on to the surface of the diaphragm. What's the name of the nerve that supplies the diaphragm? Phrenic. This is the inferior surface of the diaphragm. So these are identified as the inferior phrenic arteries. You can see them on our torso models in lab, supplying the inferior aspect of the diaphragm. Most of these vessels, as we move through, as you see with the phrenic, are going to have the names of the organs that they supply or the membrane that they pass through. Our next vessel is a single vessel, about 1.5 inches long. So in our models, it's relatively short. And it's known as the celiac trunk. It has 3 branches. The first branch goes to the stomach. Here's a case where you need to use the left term, and it's known as the left gastric artery. The second branch goes to the spleen, which is on the left side of the body, and is known as the splenic artery. Really difficult name to remember. And the third branch goes to the liver and is known as the common, or you may refer to it just as the hepatic artery. So I'll diagram these in place. Here is the left gastric as it curves around the inside surface of the stomach, which is kind of J-shaped. Going over to the spleen, drawing a dotted line because it's actually behind the stomach. Is the splenic artery. And then going over to the liver. Is the hepatic artery. Okay, celiac trunk, obviously a good lecture question. 3 branches, left gastric, splenic, and hepatic. The next vessel is really long. It supplies an organ that's 21 feet long, and it also supplies another organ that's about 8 feet long. I'm not going to draw all of that. Okay? It supplies the small intestine, and it supplies the large intestine, which forms an upside-down U. But it supplies the ascending and transverse components of that, which is on the right side of the body. So we draw this vessel going over to the right side of the body. And it's going to have multiple branches off where it goes to the small intestine. travels through a layer of peritoneum called the mesentery. And so, under numbers here. So this is identified as the superior mesenteric artery. We have two vessels and two organs known as the kidneys, or the renal organs, and sitting on top of them, if you remember from our very short endocrine component, were the adrenals or suprarenals. All of the blood goes through the kidneys multiple times a day. And so we have very large renal arteries. Again, our term for kidney is renal. And then we have adrenal arteries going to the adrenal glands. So coming from the aorta itself, and coming off of the renal arteries, we have the superior adrenal and, the middle adrenal, superior we're not drawing on here, and inferior adrenal arteries. So middle, coming from the aorta, and you can call them suprarenal or adrenal. And they're paired because we have two sets of those organs. The next vessels are also paired because they're going to the gonads. If they're going to the ovaries, we call them ovarian. If they're going to the testes, we call them testicular. And if we don't know, because it's a whiteboard and I haven't put any anatomical structures to let you know, we just call them gonadal. So if they're male, they're going to go down into the scrotal sac. If they're female, they're going to go down into the pelvis. And we'll see these when we do the reproductive system. Gonadal arteries. Then we still have the descending colon to supply, and the sigmoid colon, the last third of our large intestine. That's on the left side of the body. So 34 is going to be the inferior. Let me move up here. Mesenteric artery. And one of the branches off of the inferior mesenteric artery going to the top of the rectum is known as the superior rectal artery. From the posterior aspect of the aorta, all the way along the abdominal aorta, just like the posterior intercostals, we have branches coming off that supply abdominal muscles of the back, as well as the spinal cord, and these are known as lumbar arteries. They're going to be off the back of the aorta. Finally, the aorta end, just at the top of the sacrum. There's a small vessel that travels down the anterior aspect of the sacrum, known as the median sacral. Not medial, but median, meaning directly in the midline. that goes down into the pelvis. So I want to finish off this area. We'll do the lower extremity, which isn't much in lab, but I want to finish off this portion here by briefly doing the pelvis. I'm not going to diagram, nor do you need to know in lab all the arteries, but I want you to know the organs that are supplied. So the aorta ends by forming two branches that run along the true rib of the pelvis. And going down inside the pelvis are a pair of branches. So this is known as the common iliac arteries. Just like our common carotids, it divides to form external iliac, which is going to pass into the lower extremity, and the internal iliac. That's all you have to identify in lab, but I want you to know the organs that are supplied by the internal iliac. So, organs of the pelvic cavity, uterus for a female, along with vagina, the urinary bladder, most of the rectum that's not supplied by the superior rectal artery. All right. Prostate gland for males. And one more vessel, because you already know the nerve, passing through the obturator foramen. Guess what we have? The obturator artery. So passing through that huge obturator foramen are three structures: obturator nerve, obturator artery, and obturator vein. That's it. The rest of that is a fascial structure. All right, so I'll stop there. We've got 4 vessels to do in the lower extremity, and we'll do that in lab as I go over the models with you. You know the femoral artery. Okay, it has the same names as our nerves. All right, I'll leave that up there. You guys need to take additional photos if you wish.